From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name's Jennifer Harpster. I'm a digital reference specialist for the Science, Technology, and Business Division here at the Library of Congress. I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Farming, Food Security, and Climate Change. This program is the first of a series of programs in 2009 that is presented through a partnership between my division and NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center. Our speaker today is research scientist and geographer Molly Brown from Goddard's Biospheric Science Branch. Dr. Brown works on long-term data record development, as well as on the impact of climate change on developing countries in Africa. Molly received her MA in 1999 and PhD in 2002, both in geography from the University of Maryland at College Park. Before becoming a geographer, she got a bachelor's degree in biology at Tufts University and then joined the Peace Corps, yay, serving from 1992 to 1994 in Senegal, West Africa. During her studies at Maryland, Dr. Brown worked at NASA and worked with the U.S. Agency for International Development Famine Early Warning Systems Network. That's also called USAID. Currently, she is NASA's representative on the USAID Famine Early Warning System Board of Directors. She serves on the National Council of the Association of American Geographers and chairs the Science Committee of the Baltimore-Washington Partnership for Forest Stewardship. In 2008, she received NASA's Exceptional Achievement in Science Award and published a monograph with Springer Verlag entitled Famine Early Warning Systems and Remote Sensing Data. Whew. Okay. Today's lecture will focus on the global food system, how climate change will differentially affect the poorest countries with subsistence agricultural systems, and how local agricultural capacity continues to be at the center of food provision for many of the world's poorest. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Molly Brown.
All right, so thank you all very much for coming, and I really appreciate that there's so many people and that we have a shortage of chairs. So today I will talk again about the global food system, and I'll begin with a definition of food security, about how food production and food security are related, and how food prices and fuel prices are interact and how they impact food security. I'll also give you a little bit of insight about West Africa and how food and local food prices are related, and then I'll go back up to the global scale. And let me just say that I'll give you the punchline now. The bottom line is that how the people who live in agricultural societies, how successful they are in agricultural development and agriculture and food production themselves has a huge impact on their ability to feed themselves. And that there's a lot of global factors which impact their ability to produce food and enough food to feed themselves and their families. And this will have a big impact on us, as well as on their future ability to be food secure. So food security is not the security of fields, but really is the ability of all people to attain sufficient food for an active and healthy life. And so, and of course, despite the technical capacity to feed every single person on the planet adequately, we have still failed to do so. And there are a lot of trends that contribute to food insecurity globally, and these include population growth, energy costs, geopolitical disparities, distribution of natural resources, and of course climate. And so none of these things are new. They all have been around for centuries, literally. I mean, obviously there's always been poor regions and rich regions, and the difference now is that there are a lot more people on the planet. And the planet isn't getting any bigger, and although a lot of places have had great technological transformations other places haven't. And so the fact that in 2009 we're still talking about food security and food security problems really means that we haven't done a good job moving the technology from places that have it to the places that don't have it. And of course, global monitoring of food resources needs global data, and that is why I'm talking to you about this today. It's because NASA is a very important player, actor in using satellite remote sensing to look at global food production. Today we have a huge amount of different kinds of agricultural areas all over the world, and because of globalization, it really makes a big difference to the price of bread in DC. If we have a big drought in 3 out of the 5 major wheat producing areas, the price of wheat will go up. And that has really been the first time that this has happened. So global monitoring of resources and food production needs satellites because they are obviously global. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on hunger. So there are a lot of places that have a lot of that are food insecure. We have these places that look black on the screen here, which have over 35% of the entire population is food insecure, and that's men, women, children. But it's usually not all the time. It's at some point they have a deficit of resources, and there are a lot of different countries. So look at where those are, and some of those same countries are expecting to double their population in the next 50 years. These are the projections from 2005 to 2050. And again, in the same way, we have a lot of regions here which are likely to have a deficit in rainfall. And although there are 2 different colors on my screen here, it doesn't look like it here, but I think that there are a lot of different areas that will also experience decline in rainfall. And globally, everyone is expected to have increasing temperatures due to industrialization. So this is a plot from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2007 report, which you all should have heard about, thanks to Al Gore. I'm sure you've all heard of it. And so what this plot shows us is that, in all the different continents, we expect to see the black line is the observed temperature change from 1900 to 2000. So we see this huge increase in observed temperatures, and this shaded area here on all these different plots is the global climate change models. The global climate models, they're the models which show that we are capturing this increase in temperatures. When you drive those models with simply pre-industrial CO2 or other greenhouse gases, we expect to see this no changes in temperatures. And what we can conclude from this slide is that the global climate models do a great job in capturing variations in temperature, and that in Africa, so for example, if we look at this, we see that we expect that we've seen a 1 degree increase in temperatures throughout the last 100 years, and that the temperatures are likely to continue to increase because, of course, we're continuing our industrial activities and very little has been done to reduce greenhouse gases. Another point I wanted to make is that the global climate models although they capture the variations in temperatures extremely well, they're not very good at capturing changes in rainfall. So we really don't know what is likely to happen with variations with the water cycle in many places of the world. It might be that a lot of places will get wetter and other places will get drier, but we still don't know where those places will be. So another consequence of increasing temperatures is that we're likely to see in semi-arid zones, places that get very little water today, increasing evapotranspiration and a reduction in the amount so this area here are places that we expect to see 20% reduction in the growing period in this scenario from the climate change panel, and basically that is the business as usual scenario. And the one on the right, we see far less area impacted by a shorter growing season, and that's for a scenario where we actually change our behavior and the amount of CO2 going into the atmosphere. So let me talk a little bit now that I've given that introduction of where we're at globally. How does food demand markets and ecosystems interact? So here we have agricultural production, and this is just simply how much food is produced by every farmer in a particular country. And my great example I like to use is Niger, because unlike Senegal, where I have a lot of personal experience, Niger is a landlocked country. It has no ports, practically no rivers, and has very few ways of exporting its goods other than over really bad roads. And so climate change, therefore, as I was just showing you, will probably impact rainfall. We don't know exactly how, but it'll definitely make temperatures go up. And these things will impact agricultural production. But today I want to say that, these changes are really quite minimal or really not as important as all the other things going on. So we have a growing population, which is very, very important. The more people there are, the more agriculture happens, the more fields are planted, and the more food that's produced. And there's also rising diet expectations. So all the people move to the city want to eat more meat and poultry and eggs and milk. And that has a big impact on what the farmers do. Do they produce, very high or efficient or row crops, or do they make dairy farm, or what do they do? Especially in places like China and India, the trends and what people eat has a big impact on what people produce globally. And then we have other market forces, demand for natural resources here. And a big one here is water. So if you have a lot more people wanting electricity, and so you have competing demands between farmers who want to irrigate crops, big dams that will be put in to make electricity, and urban areas that really will want more water. And we can look at, for example, California. Just in the last couple of days, they've announced that the farmers are out of luck because the urban areas are going to need more water than was expected, and so therefore the farmers are just going to be like, I'm sorry, we're not going to give you guys any more irrigation water. And that doesn't include all the demands for natural ecosystems and for electricity. And so all of these things interact to impact agricultural production. And then we have the big one, technology. We all know that the agricultural systems in the West are very different than those in subsistence agricultural areas. And I'll talk about this more, but this has a big impact on how much grain is produced per square meter on the ground. So all these things interact, we have more people, and then there's this feedback here where if we don't get enough, or if we don't have enough food produced in a particular area, you have increasing land area and cultivation, because, for example, there's inadequate technology, which leads to landscape alterations, which then feed into the climate change and cause further increases in temperature and further declines in rainfall, for example. And this is a particularly important one in West Africa, where soil moisture has a huge impact on whether or not it rains. So given all of this, the research that I've been doing for the last couple of years has shown that Africa is no longer self-sufficient. I mean, they really need, and they rely on importing food from the international commodity markets, just like everyone else. And this is because their yields have not increased since 1950. There's been very little investment in technology such as irrigation, improved seeds, fertilizer, and it means that Africa's agriculture is far more weather dependent than everybody else's agriculture, because if it doesn't rain, they do not have technology or technological sort of assistance, for example, drip irrigation, to help them continue to produce even when it's really dry. And the impact of this lack of investment and the lack of increases in yields means that sub-Saharan Africa, the place that we do a lot of work in the early warning systems, has seen an increase in the number of people malnourished or have undernourishment, whereas everyone else, South Asia, East Asia, have seen a rapid decline since 1969 in the number of people who are food insecure. Now notice, these are still a lot of people, and so there's a lot more people obviously in East Asia and South Asia than there are in Africa, but so the percentages are significantly different. However, we still have, Africa is really losing the development game. Okay, so what is the impact of prices? So as we all know, last year was an extraordinary year. We had a ridiculous increase in petroleum prices. We had a huge amount of food price increases, and then we had the big crash. And now, what was it this morning? $40 a gallon, $40 a barrel of oil this morning. I heard on the radio. And so these kinds of huge spikes have a huge impact on the ability of people in Africa to access food. And the reason is that there's a strong link between oil prices and maize prices when the price of petroleum is more than $50 a barrel. When it's less than $50 a barrel, there's very little relationship. And that's because when oil is more than $50 a barrel, the sheer cost of moving your grain from one place to another impacts its cost. So if you see here, when it's over $50 or $80 a barrel, we see a very strong relationship. And anything underneath that, you have a big mess of points. So the impact of the huge price spike in 2008 was, as you might expect, large numbers of food riots, social instability in places with urban areas with lots of poor people in them. And I won't go through all the different areas, but you can see it was very well distributed across the planet. And in some of the same countries, we had significant access problems. And the reason for this is that if you are a poor farmer and you live in northern Niger, you are only able to grow about 50% of your annual requirements, your family's requirements, and that's it. So you need to come up with some sort of thing that you do to get the rest of your family's food needs for the rest of the year. So you are able to grow 6 months, and then you have to buy 6 months of food on the market. Those markets are very much influenced by global commodity prices when they're high, but when they're low, they're much more influenced by the price, the local production. So all of these countries had price-related food insecurity, and this one over here, if you can. And there's a lot more food insecurity in South America that isn't represented in this plot, but they're, in my opinion. But I'm an African. I know a lot more about Africa than South America. So now we're going to talk a little bit about West Africa. So what is the difference between West Africa and some of these other regions, say like here in the United States, something that we all are well aware of since we all live here. So the environmental conditions are much more important to people's ability to feed themselves in West Africa because it's an agricultural economy. They're all agricultural economy, which means that 85% of the people who live in the country have some connection to a farm or make their living off of trading commodities or doing something which is agriculturally related. And so one of the things that is really important to remember is that the transaction costs in Africa are huge. This is because the roads are very small. They are full of potholes. We have transportation that looks like this, and the markets look like this. And basically everybody who is in the market buys and sells food in kilograms or half a kilo of grain at a time. And so we have many traders who are trading very, very tiny amounts. And I like to compare this to when you buy a loaf of bread at Walmart, the number of transactions you can literally count them on one hand. So you have the farmer who produced the food, the grain, he sold it to a grain elevator, that's one. The grain elevator guy buys it from 50 farmers, and then he sells his grain to the bread guy, the bread maker, say Wonder Bread, that's two. And Wonder Bread makes 50,000 loaves of bread, which they sell all of them to Walmart. That's three. And then they move the bread from there. And then you are four when you buy that bread. That's 4 transactions. That means you have massive industrial scale and efficiencies. In Africa, you have maybe 50,000 different transactions for the same amount of grain. And that's because everyone buys and sells in such tiny amounts. The farmer himself, when he harvests his grain, he takes a small bag to the market and sells that grain in order to buy clothes and shoes for his children or to pay off debts that he incurred during the year. And then the person he sold that to sells little tiny amounts of the grain to 50 other people. And so if you do the math, you see how inefficient the system is, and how every time you buy and sell, everyone will get a profit, a piece of the pie. And that makes the food system there extremely inefficient. And it means that local production is at the center of food security because it's so inefficient to move the grain from one place to another. And what happens is you end up eating the grain that was produced right near where you live. And what the impact of that is that when you have a drought in a particular place, which is a local, if you have a drought that affects a system like this, it has a hugely different impact than when you have a drought in an industrial system. In an industrial system, it hardly matters if Walmart buys the grain from Kansas or from Argentina. The difference is simply it's actually very hard to tell the difference from our point of view, because the commodity price, the commodity markets takes transportation into account. Whereas if you eat the food which is locally produced when you have a drought, each farmer, you have a massive collapse of the market, because if you're a farmer, you usually produce 150% of your needs, right? And all of a sudden, you only produce 50% of that. Not only are you no longer have an income, but all of a sudden your outlay expenses for feeding your family go up by 4, because you all of a sudden have to buy food, which you used to grow yourself. And so you see what I'm saying? So they get both ends of this. It's really quite, this is why environmental and climate change will have such a big impact in these kinds of subsistence systems. Because if you can see that if you're a farmer and that's the only source of income, you're really in big trouble. So, so environmental variability in West Africa is a big driver of a lot of the activity of what everyone is very, very conservative, and they don't invest. They don't put their investment in agriculture because it's too risky. They do what everyone else does. They put it in, markets, and they invest in bicycles, or they invest in, cell phones. They don't invest in agriculture, and this is one of the reasons why the yield has not increased at all since 1950. We're not investing there, and they certainly are not going to invest in their own agricultural potential either. So the capital flight from this region is 10 times what it is in the US, if you can imagine. So remote sensing, getting back to the remote sensing, it's a very big player in trying to figure out what's going on in these subsistence systems. Because of the humongous diversity, we really need to we need to know when there's a problem which is in a large enough area to affect a large number of markets. So remote sensing provides a very clear identification of changes in agricultural production over multiple markets, which otherwise we would never know about. It's the earliest source of information, and it's also the least controversial. You can imagine that for USAID, it's very hard to make decisions if you get information only from the countries who are concerned, because they are obviously very interested sometimes in getting assistance, because it's a huge source of external information and external, funds for their country, and very, a lot of the presidents, you have a lot of things like the president himself owns half the trucks in the country, kind of thing. So that might be a problem. So remote sensing is a very easy way to get everyone on board. And remote sensing that I'm particularly, I spend a lot of time looking at is vegetation index, which basically looks at how green the ground is, and which can be directly related to how much, whether or not the crop is very well watered and happy, basically. So if it's photosynthesizing, the green index is high, and if it's not photosynthesizing well, the green index is low. However, we have another big difference between subsistence and industrial agriculture, in that here, this is an example of the industrial system where you have these big fields. You see these roads here. There's very little natural vegetation in this 1 kilometer pixel, which is bounded by this little square. But here's the same 1 kilometer pixel in Africa, and this is I forget where it is. I think it's in CAR. But here you see these little tiny white flecks, which are the fields, because they're all hand hoed. They're very, very tiny, and so you get a lot of natural vegetation mixed up with the agricultural vegetation. And this is a problem which we have a lot of issues with, but we're able to still derive information from the remote sensing. And a study I did a couple years ago has shown that we are able to relate drought to agricultural production, and then agricultural production to the price of food. And so when there's a lot of when there's a widespread drought, you have a large increase in prices. And when there's a lot, when the growing season was really great, the prices of food falls through the floor. So you can imagine if you're a farmer, it's really a bummer, because when the prices are great, you have nothing to sell. And when you produced a lot, you have no market because everyone else produced a lot. So it's really a very difficult situation. And world market integration has not really helped, unfortunately, because people in the middle of the continent have very little access. And so limited integration for these the farmers in Niger, basically leads to a lack of a strong export market, reducing their ability to profit when prices are high. But the low purchasing power caused extreme food prices when the world market is really high. They're unable to access that market. So all of these things mean that things like this occurs. In 2005, Niger had a big food security crisis, and it was because of increasing food prices in other regions and demand for their food, but not from local production problems. So the close association of local food prices to environmental conditions means that when there is a drought, we have even in the region, we have a huge increase in prices, and that causes a food security disaster, even when there's enough food in the market, because people just cannot buy the food. Okay, so that is all I'm going to say about West Africa. And to summarize, basically, the increasing number of people, urbanization, fossil fuel shortages, and transformation of the commodity market all work together to make adaptation to climate change really complicated, particularly in regions where, like West Africa, that are so agriculture in their they're very, they really have a lot of problems to respond to climate change. And how we respond to these crises makes a big difference. If we're able to provide assistance which will help their markets, strengthen their roads, we'll do a much better job than simply giving them food. Giving them food will destroy their markets and really further reduce the incentives to invest in agricultural production. So one of the solutions that my colleague Chris Funk and I really believe in is that a big adaptation to climate change in this region is to produce more food, to really invest in agriculture. If we can increase the per capita production, particularly in these food insecure regions, we will reduce food insecurity by reducing reliance on international markets and to get small farmers to invest in their own land again. So, and clearly there's the amount of food. This is a plot which shows that that yield gains are linear. Here, this basically shows that the use of food if there were no hungry people in the world. So if everyone ate the same amount of food, if everyone ate our standard 2,000 calorie diet, and we know in the US we are not doing this, and we know in Africa they are not doing this, but if everyone ate 2,000 calories a day exactly, this is the amount of food we would need for everyone. In actuality, of course, our production goes like this. It jumps all over the place, right? And it means that this gap here means that there are a lot of people who are not, we're really not winning the game. We're really going to pretty soon have trouble feeding everyone at the same level. We're not producing enough food for everyone on the planet, and this gap is going to increase. Now, if we look at the production in the top 5 aid receivers for food security crises, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, we see this is a curve showing the population increase. And here are the statistics, the actual statistics for cropped area, seeds, and fertilizer. The use. So that Chris Funk and I are basically say that this is agricultural capacity. So if the amount of area that you plant, how many seeds you buy to plant, and the fertilizer you use on that is the agricultural capacity. And the gap here is the growing gap between agricultural capacity and population. And here we have rainfall. And you notice the rainfall trend is quite insignificant. It's not very impressive. And really, so what I'm trying to conclude here is that, in fact, it's really the climate is the least of our troubles. In this kind of situation, whether or not it rains is quite irrelevant. If it rains, it's great. If it doesn't rain, it's really bad. But in either case, we have 9 million unfed people every year in Ethiopia alone. And that's just because there's too many people who are all trying to do agriculture at the same time. And that's all they're trying to do. And that's it, So if we extended this model from 2000 to 2030, and we said, okay, so if we have just population increase and no further investment in agriculture, we see that by 2030, we have 110 food insecure people, which are, incidentally, we are going to have to feed. Because Anderson Cooper, although by 2030 he may have retired, people like Anderson Cooper are not going to let us get away with just ignoring half the world while they're starving, right? I mean, if you think we're going to just be able to ignore this problem, I think it's going to be really expensive. We're already spending, what is it, $500 million on food assistance every year in one form or another. Maybe 250 in strictly food aid. So, and that's $1 million. So here we are in 2000. So this is population increases, right? This gray one here is with modeled reductions in precipitation. So if you couple the increase in population with the increases in reductions in rainfall and temperature increases, we have nearly 200 million undernourished people in these 5 countries. But the good news is if we spend some of this money that we would have put in food aid on agricultural development, in drip irrigation systems that use very little water. There's, hydroponic solutions for vegetables. There are so many great investments that we can make in Africa to increase food production. We can reduce the food insecure to a fraction of what they are today. So, and to look at this in a different way, we can see that, so this is the projected change in yields from today to 2030, given a linear, yield increase. So this is obviously the big juggernaut over here, East Asia, 7,500. This is actually above the expected yield potential. So this is the best case. This is the, if all those seed companies just do the miracle that they keep promising for our U.S. taxpayer dollar, right? So it's 7,500 kilograms per hectare. It's just ridiculously high. So suppose that this is what happens, right? Everyone else, we have 3,000, 7,000 in the U.S. and Canada, 4,000. But look at Africa. We're still at just ridiculously low levels of yields. So if we can, it's actually so much easier to increase yields in places that only get 1,000 kilograms per hectare than to try to increase China's already ridiculously productive agricultural systems to 7,000. In other words, if you're at 6,000 kilograms per hectare and you want to go up to 7,000, you have to double the amount of water, triple the amount of fertilizer. It's actually technically nearly infeasible given the number of people in the region and the stress on the resources already. Why don't we invest in trying to increase the amount of production in these regions so we no longer have to ship food from Indonesia to Africa? We can have the people there use their land productively. And I'm not saying that agricultural development is easy. I mean, clearly, it's not easy, but we haven't been trying very hard. I can say that since 1950, the investment in Africa as in the entire region has reduced to 30% of what it was in 1950. And at the same time, the Africans themselves are shipping their money out to France and the U.S. because they also say, this ship is sinking. My money's going out. So to invest in increasing these the very, very low productive capacity in these regions is a much better bet than to simply take food that's produced here and mail it over here every time there's a crisis, essentially. So that's my pitch. So in conclusion, population expansion is coupled with reductions in yields is a big threat to food security in regions with limited purchasing power, and might I add, to much of the rest of the world as well. So it's not just that they are going to be highly food insecure. In 20, 30, 40 years, we're going to really come in come into a problem of trying to feed everyone on the planet, and someone's going to go short, and there's sure to be wars fought over this. Local food markets, large and small, respond to variations in local production as well as to global prices. So again, local production is absolutely the center of food security for the developing world at the moment. They have not moved into the industrial system. So, and local production is still central to the economy and to food security, which is why remote sensing is so important, why remote sensing is so critical to not only monitoring the food security in these regions that are threatened, but also for our own commodity prices. We use remote sensing extensively in the USDA's Foreign Agricultural Service to determine whether or not commodity prices are going to go up or down. And finally, increasing productivity of marginal agricultural areas is really the key. It's the only way to hedge against the fact that we're at peak oil now, and that from every decade that goes by, once we get out of this tricky phase that we're in right this minute, hopefully soon, the stock market will start going back up again. And when that happens, it's very likely that petroleum prices will go up again, above $50, $80 a barrel. And when that happens, these places that make 35, that have such little purchasing power will have trouble competing with the large industrializing regions of the world. Thank you. We have lots of time, so if anyone wants to ask a question. Yes?
Do you have an idea of how much investment would be required to make a dent
Yeah.
in the region that you've been studying?
Quite a lot. But, there's so much stuff that can be done for so little. Like in Kenya, for example, there have been, or Rwanda, I should say. Rwanda has been a great example where they refuse to take the advice of the World Bank and are simply giving away fertilizer, and they've doubled their yields in the past 5 years. And they basically say, we don't care about your market theory. We refuse to believe you, and we're going to just give away. And every year they've given away fertilizer. And that government investment in agricultural development, if you see what I'm saying, because if you have fertilizer, then you might as well invest in seeds. You can use your fertilizer as a collateral on a loan. You can sell half of it and take the rest. So there's so much stuff that can be done with just. We're not talking a lot of money, but I can tell you that one of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has recently entered the fray in the last 12 months. They've started a huge agricultural development project, and in that project, no country can get a dime unless they invest 10% of their national income in agriculture, and that will make a huge difference. If the government will do it, because right now, frankly, no farmer would invest in their own. I mean, there's huge amounts of money leaving the region. So we need to sort of begin to change that. Yes, sorry.
You address the big companies coming in with like the transgenic crops and trying to give them, genetically modified stuff or anything like that?
Well, I know very little about that, but I can tell you that the recent assessment on agriculture, the IIASTD, and don't ask me for the name of the acronym, but it's a really great study, and that is eloquent on transgenic crops. And basically, in my opinion, we aren't doing, that's step number 52, and we're not doing steps 1 through 5 yet. And so that's so irrelevant at the moment. I'm interested in the big picture. We have so much obvious stuff to do at the moment. So why argue even slightly about transgenic crops if people are not even, they're using seeds which they've used for centuries that have 5,000 different kinds of phenotype. I mean, we need to just get them to work on 3 or 4. It's
just the arguments of those big companies. They always say, oh, you're going to increase your crop yields, you're going to do, all this, but then we own the seeds and you have to buy the seeds back from us, and it just seems not like a win situation at all.
Yeah.
Well, for the company it is, but not for the actual.
But I think the agricultural development community has rejected this argument quite effectively, from what I can tell. But it's quite outside my personal expertise. Yes?
What are the land ownership characteristics of Niger? Are they tribal, or are they held in, is the land held individually? Or does the government own the surface of the land and rent it?
The answer is yes, all of the above. It's a very complex, very immature, and extraordinarily expensive to change anything to do. So they are trying to change, one of the big things 5 or 10 years ago was tenure rights, and let's change the system. You can't have the government own everything. But it's like, if you have a piece of property on the New Jersey coast, then you're willing to spend $10,000 to get your title fixed. If you have a piece of property in the middle of Niger, 50 miles outside of Niamey with no road and no rainfall, and you wouldn't spend 3 cents per acre to figure it out. Literally.
Why would you stay on that piece of ground then?
Because the option is to move to Niamey.
Yes.
A lot of people are doing that, but in the meantime, there's always the old people, and they're able to hang on and do some agriculture, and meanwhile they do 5 or 10 other things. Nobody only is an agriculturalist anymore. Everybody does everything.
It's like West Virginia then.
Yes. Yes, literally. The value of the property is zero, more or less. You can't give it away. And so, but what's really eloquent is to look at this plot shows you, this is the productivity per worker. Here, the yellow line there is East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. It's negative since 1950. It's just bad. It's terrible, Yes.
I have to object a little bit to the implication that African farmers should be sort of moving toward the U.S. model.
No, I don't.
It's just sort
Yeah.
of implicit in your photos, because I think.
No, I
first
agree
of
with you,
all,
yeah.
Traditional systems and cultures have, and all of those little tiny plots interspersed with forests and wild foods. There's very important nutritional consequences, very important environmental consequences. There's very important cultural consequences of the production systems. And I hope you're not promoting which unfortunately I think the U.S. foreign aid does a lot, the U.S. model of agriculture, which has brought us nothing but water pollution, cancer, depleting the soils, et cetera, in this country. So
But
I think we need a new model that it isn't quite transferring our technology there.
No, I agree. I'm not. I have noticed I haven't said anything about John Deere, and I agree with you, but there's a lot more we can do. There's no one, I think the fact that there's 4 times more people now than in 1950 has to be dealt with. We cannot, I think food aid does not work. It does not work. It destroys the markets, and it's harmful for everyone, and no one likes corn from Kansas. If you are used to white corn from beautiful, sweet white corn from Zimbabwe, and you're all of a sudden eating this hard yellow stuff, no one likes that. We must do something. I am not an advocate for transferring the large fields. However, it would be nice to produce a lot more food in regions that can do it. Think of there's a wonderful place in Kenya called the Big 5 region in Kenya that has increased their yields by 5 times in the past 10 years by doing some big changes. They have some irrigation, they have some larger fields, they also invest in seeds and fertilizer, but that small area is able to feed 9/10 of the people who are then able to continue with traditional agriculture. So I'm not saying that that I do not think that it's even possible, even conceivable to move, but we must do something, because what we're doing now does not work. We've got to do something. Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think that the local systems are so desperately depleted, and there's just a desperate
Need to do,
priority.
right.
We need to invest and rebuild local farm
Right.
systems.
Maybe it's just roads. We just get a road in there and it will do something,
Roads. I think it needs to be, we have, as you said, so much technology developed for increasing production. In so
Hydroponics, it could be
But
anything.
I think the solutions have to be locally generated. So that's sort of the key, I think, to
Right.
But I also, because you can't have solutions that are, you can't have technology packages imposed from the outside on
I
these local fragile systems. And
Absolutely.
a lot of the models, like the GMO models, or they have these value
That's
chain
right.
models where they think they can just blanket the world with magic bullets. And I think even though they realize that and I think it's that magic bullet thinking that's dangerous, that this top-down value chain magic bullet thinking is dangerous. It needs to be the understanding that the solutions really have to be locally, they have to be arrived at in the context of the local system, whether the system is a district or an ecology
Right.
or whatever. But the other question I wanted to ask you was, what do you think about the possibility of using sort of mitigation mechanisms to fund development of this kind of, to give farmers and farming communities a sort of a mechanism for getting funds to invest in agriculture in places like this? What's your thinking on that issue? There's a lot of talk about it.
I can tell you that when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Senegal, the minute you brought $50 to the table, your fabulous, incredibly enthusiastic partners were all instantly replaced with the scoundrels and the worst of the worst. So, I mean, money really will destroy the local. What I am really advocating is local investment in local, and to try to bring some solutions which can come in and invest in the ones that work locally. So do not have a lot of hope about this big transfer of mechanisms from CO2 capture. What will really help Africans is to try to put the money in our own problem. We need to stop putting CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere so we don't transform their climate before they get a chance. And our climate too, incidentally. Everybody's climate before we all get a chance to figure out what to do. If we don't move fast, we're going to all be in a pickle of trouble. And, we're going to have as much trouble getting grain as everyone else. I mean, I think that we need to spend our own money cleaning up our own house. And we need to be giving technology to places like China and India and cleaning up their act and just saying, I don't care about, sovereignty. Please, please take our technology and fix your problem so the ship doesn't go down. Because there is no place for the rats to go to, I mean, I want us to fix our own problem. I mean,
So you think that kind of mechanism would be totally corrupting?
I mean, look at all the great help development has caused, the great development that the last 50 years of development. I don't work for AID. I'm sorry. I mean, this is one of the reasons I really do not believe development, in quotes, works very well. I think the only thing we can do is give people space and to try to do our best.
So how do you get the money there?
I know they do. I don't know. I think that there are some, Grameen Bank, for example, is a great example, where you have 0% interest loans and small scale. It's got to be small. It's got to be locally sensitive, politically adapted to the local situation.
They desperately need investment.
I totally agree. I do not know. You're talking to the wrong person. Yes.
I was intrigued by your statement about how in Niger, wherever it was, where they ignored the advice they had gotten and did the fertilizer thing instead. What was the advice that they had gotten?
Oh, well. It's a typical neoliberalist policy that if you provide something for free, you will destroy the system. Whereas if you make someone pay for it, you'll create a market. Whereas in fact, if you're dealing with people with only make 35 cents a day, they do not have any money and therefore will just continue on. They do not have the resources to buy fertilizer at market prices. So
they were trying to get them to
purchase, and the government has never had enough money they just couldn't. By giving away the fertilizer, you start you then provide a farmer with a standard amount, and they can sell half of it and buy improved seeds or seeds which can be used with fertilizer, if you see what I'm saying. So so agriculture is not as complicated as political and economic systems. So at least, we know some things about it. Yes. Cassava.
Just heard on the radio
Such a
that
great
they were
thing.
Investing in
Yes.
different ways of dealing with cassava instead of having all of these small amounts,
Mhm.
or actually enormous amounts of market going to waste,
Mhm.
investing in refrigeration to
Right.
preserve it, investing in manufacturing to convert it to flour. Do you have an opinion on those kinds of investments?
I like cassava. It's yummy. It's a good idea. I mean, I think the only issue with cassava I've heard is that it takes a lot of security. You can't do cassava agriculture in places without security. So Niger, eastern Niger and Chad, Angola, people will come and steal your cassava plants because it's 18-month crop.
Physical on the
Yeah. So, yes, Jeannie.
This may be a question requiring an answer you don't have, but
Sure.
Do you have some sense of how close we are to being able to predict regional precipitation due to warming temperatures?
Not close at all. I do not think we're very close.
So what are the factors?
And I think that it really does depend on the region. But in Africa in particular, there's a great paper by Cook and Vizzi, which shows that of the 25 IPCC models, only 3 have a realistic representation of the climate, where your easterly waves are going east and not west. So that actually has some realistic, and even with those 3, one says the climate won't change a lot, one says it's going to get a lot wetter, and the other one says it's going to get a lot drier. So particularly in Africa, they're really hard up for good data and information. It's really quite bad. But things are changing really fast. I'm not a climate scientist. I think there are a lot of other people, but it's very hard to do good. The water cycle is very difficult, and representation of those clouds is a tricky problem.
Yeah, clouds.
Clouds is very difficult. Yes.
I have to know someone who was just invited to go and work with an investor on a food security project. But I'm wondering if it might be useful for him to listen to your presentation. How would we access that? Is it available online?
It will be.
It will be.
It
should be webcast on the library's
Sometimes it
website.
takes time. Mary Jane?
Yeah, the library has a site where these things are webcast, but it does take them a while. There's a little bit of a backlog. Maybe in 2 months, Chuck?
But you can come and get my card, and I will send you a PowerPoint.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry.
It seems that the underlying problem here is population, the explosion of population.
Well, it's not just in Africa. It's globally,
But in your focus on this particular, where traditionally it seems that you would expect if you have famine or a shortage of food and other resources, that the population tends to adjust itself and go down, like in the animal kingdom, four-legged animal kingdom tends to. This model is very different. It feels like, from what you're saying, from what we read, in spite of these shortages, the population is continuing to explode.
Very true. And you know why? It's because if you are a woman, right, and you want to, if you're highly insecure, you have 10 kids because half of them will die of one thing or another, and you're just really horribly nervous, and you need more people. So actually, in Africa, it's been a very underpopulated continent. Africa is actually very underpopulated compared to China. There's 10 times more people per square foot in China than there is in Africa. The problem is the technology. Technology changes the sort of environment people equation. The problem is that we're operating, the traditional, so it's no linear relationship. It's not a Malthusian equation, let me put it that way. So there's actually very huge labor shortage during the agricultural season because everyone is out there with their hoe, and literally there's not enough people to do, to make all the fields which are needed because they're using hoes, right? So there's really there are not enough people in some ways. The problem is that when you have places like Ethiopia, right? They have the same amount of land and resources and more people now, finally, than the kind of technology and what everyone's trying to do is agriculture. So it's a problem. So, what I'm trying to say is that I do not believe in Malthusian, sort of projections of gloom and doom. What we need to do is have some people do some other stuff, like, making chips or something. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but you see what I'm saying? So we've got to get some people to do something other than agriculture so that they can compete on the global scale. Yes, I mean, you can help me out. Thank you very much.
Well, I actually have another question.
Yeah.
I mean, I completely agree with you. Technology is a huge
The technology is the
factor
big
that
factor, yeah.
conditions the would be a
Mhm.
equation. But I have, to get back to the issue of water, I was, and the unpredictability, I mean, it may be, a couple of questions. It may be true that the models are really poor at predicting the consequences for local water cycles.
Correct.
But is it safe to say that it will become more variable? Is that pretty safe? At least the curve you had was.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then the next
I mean-
question I had, you mentioned something about soil moisture retention being an important factor in actually bringing on rain. And I'm wondering to what extent people are really looking at farming, to what extent do farming systems that really build up soil moisture and integrate crop production with, like, agro crop production systems? What do you think of those as sort of the potential of those to, like,
Yeah.
kill many birds with one stone, so to speak?
It's a great-
What do you think about that?
Go ahead. What?
I was just gonna say, feed two birds with one stone.
Exactly.
Much better metaphor.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
One crop.
Yeah. The more evapotranspiration. But we know that one of the reasons why the models work so poorly in West Africa is because the feedback between the atmosphere and the land is inadequate. So they just consider that the whole land has a uniform soil moisture, which is obviously not true because some places are wetter than others. And so you can really see that where it has rained once at the beginning of the rainy season, it continues to rain. And that place ends up with twice as much rain as a place 100 miles away where it didn't happen to rain early on in the season. And so, soil moisture, when we get, NASA's putting up a new soil moisture mission, which we really hope will greatly improve our ability to predict seasonally in the next season, the rainfall in West Africa. It's very similar to here, There are.
Very, very mindfully.
Exactly.
beginning to play on that relationship, and I think that really needs to be
Yeah.
brought into the discourse.
And then you have a lot of trouble. Suppose we had perfect forecasts for next season. Would it help a lot? You have to ask yourself a question. What can we do? How would we change the systems? What about crop insurance? The list goes on and on. So there's so much stuff that needs to be done, but we really must start focusing on putting the resources and effectively the resources where it's needed. And I think that we are done. Yes, exactly. Been waving your hands. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.